Margaret Henderson had always believed that the world owed her something special. At 52 years old, she had perfected the art of complaining her way through life, armed with an arsenal of demands and an unwavering belief that rules simply didn't apply to her. Her blonde hair was always styled in that particular cut that screamed, "I want to speak to your manager," and her voice carried the kind of authority that came from years of getting her way through sheer persistence. On this particular Tuesday morning in London, Margaret had decided to take her visiting American relatives on a tour of Buckingham Palace. She had booked the standard public tour, but in her mind, she deserved something far more exclusive. After all, she reasoned, she was a tax-paying British citizen, and these guards were essentially her employees. The morning sun cast long shadows across the palace courtyard as tourists gathered for the changing of the guard ceremony. Margaret pushed through the crowd with her usual lack of consideration, dragging her confused nephew and his wife behind her. She had promised them special access to areas most tourists never saw, though she had no actual plan for how to deliver on this promise. The royal guards stood at their posts, resplendent in their traditional red uniforms and tall black bearskin hats. These weren't just ceremonial figures. They were active soldiers from elite regiments, trained professionals who took their duty of protecting the crown seriously. Among them stood Guardsman James Mitchell, a 26-year-old veteran who had served 2 tours in Afghanistan before joining the Queen's Guard. His face remained expressionless beneath the shadow of his bearskin hat, but his eyes were alert, constantly scanning the crowd for any potential threats. Margaret had been watching the guards for several minutes, growing increasingly frustrated with what she perceived as their stubbornness in maintaining their positions. She had tried waving at them, calling out questions, and even stepping closer to the barriers, but they remained as still as statues. In her mind, this was unacceptable customer service. "Excuse me?" she called out loudly to Guardsman Mitchell, her voice cutting through the respectful murmur of other tourists. "I said excuse me. I'm trying to ask you something." The guard remained motionless, staring straight ahead as protocol demanded. The other tourists around Margaret began to shift uncomfortably, sensing that something inappropriate was about to happen. Several people pulled out their phones, perhaps sensing that they were about to witness something worth recording. Margaret's face began to redden with indignation. She had spent her entire adult life using volume and persistence to get what she wanted, and she couldn't understand why this particular employee wasn't responding to her perfectly reasonable requests for information and special treatment. "This is ridiculous," she announced to anyone within earshot. "I'm a British citizen, and I demand to know why these guards think they're too good to answer simple questions. I've paid my taxes my whole life, and I deserve some respect." Her nephew, David, tugged gently at her sleeve. "Aunt Margaret, maybe we should just enjoy the ceremony like everyone else. I think the guards aren't supposed to talk while they're on duty." But Margaret was beyond reason now. She had worked herself into one of her familiar righteous rages, the kind that had gotten her banned from 3 different shopping centers and caused countless service workers to dread her approach. She marched up to the rope barrier that separated the tourists from the guards, her sensible shoes clicking aggressively against the ancient cobblestones. "I'm talking to you," she shouted at Guardsman Mitchell, who continued to stare straight ahead with professional discipline. "Don't you dare ignore me! I want to speak to whoever's in charge here right now!" The crowd was now openly staring at the spectacle Margaret was creating. Children clung closer to their parents. Tourists whispered in multiple languages about the rude woman, and several security personnel began moving closer to the scene. But Margaret was completely oblivious to the growing tension around her, focused entirely on what she saw as her righteous battle against unacceptable customer service. That's when her eyes fell on the ceremonial sword hanging at Guardsman Mitchell's side. The blade was an integral part of his uniform, a symbol of his authority and the crown's power. It was also a very real weapon, sharp and dangerous despite its ceremonial appearance. To Margaret's entitled mind, however, it looked like nothing more than a prop, something she could use to get the guard's attention and force him to acknowledge her demands. Without warning or hesitation, Margaret ducked under the rope barrier and reached for the sword's ornate handle. The moment her fingers closed around the metal, she felt a strange resistance, as if the weapon itself was trying to warn her of the enormous mistake she was making. But Margaret was far too committed to her tantrum to pay attention to such subtle warnings. "Now will you listen to me?" she demanded triumphantly, giving the sword a sharp tug. The world seemed to freeze for just a moment. Every tourist in the vicinity stopped talking. Security personnel reached for their radios, and Guardsman Mitchell, for the first time since taking his post that morning, moved his head to look directly at the woman who had just committed what could be interpreted as an assault on a member of the Royal Guard and an attempt to steal government property. Margaret suddenly found herself staring into the cold, professional eyes of a trained soldier, and for the first time in her entire entitled life, she began to understand that she might have finally picked a fight with someone who wouldn't back down from her demands. The sword remained firmly in its sheath, secured by mechanisms she hadn't even noticed, but her hand was now trapped in a grip that felt increasingly foolish with each passing second. Around her, the crowd had gone completely silent, and Margaret slowly began to realize that every single person in the courtyard was now staring at her with expressions of shock, disgust, and anticipation. She had wanted attention, but this wasn't the kind of respectful acknowledgement she had been seeking. The silence that followed Margaret's grab for the sword lasted exactly 3 seconds, but to her, it felt like an eternity. In those 3 seconds, she watched Guardsman Mitchell's eyes transform from professional detachment to something much more serious and focused. She had expected him to finally acknowledge her, perhaps even apologize for ignoring her earlier. Instead, she found herself looking into the face of someone who had been trained to deal with much more serious threats than entitled tourists. "Ma'am, step back immediately and release the weapon." Mitchell's voice was quiet, but carried the unmistakable authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. This wasn't the polite suggestion of a customer service representative. This was a direct order from a soldier. Margaret's hand was still wrapped around the sword's handle, though she was beginning to realize that the weapon wasn't going to budge from its secure position. The ornate sheath was designed by people who understood that ceremonial weapons needed to be both impressive and secure. She tugged again, more out of stubborn pride than any real hope of success, and felt the guard's entire body tense in response. "I just want some information," she said, her voice suddenly much smaller than it had been moments before. "I'm a British citizen, and I have the right to ask questions. You people work for me, technically speaking." Around them, the crowd had formed a tight circle of onlookers, their phones now openly recording every moment of Margaret's public humiliation. Her nephew David was frantically trying to push through the crowd to reach her, his face red with embarrassment. His wife was covering her face with her hands, clearly wishing she could disappear entirely. 2 additional guards had begun moving toward the scene with the kind of purposeful stride that suggested this situation was about to become much more official. Behind them, Margaret could see palace security personnel speaking rapidly into their radios, their expressions grim and professional. She was beginning to understand that what had started as a simple demand for better customer service had somehow escalated into something much more serious. "Ma'am, this is your final warning," Guardsman Mitchell said, his voice remaining calm but carrying an edge that suggested he was prepared to use more than words if necessary. "Release the weapon and step back behind the barrier immediately." For the first time in her adult life, Margaret found herself in a situation where her usual tactics weren't working. She couldn't demand to speak to this man's manager. She couldn't threaten to take her business elsewhere. She couldn't storm off in a huff and leave negative reviews online. She was standing in one of the most secure locations in Britain, having just assaulted a member of the Royal Guard, and every second she continued to hold on to that sword was making her situation exponentially worse. The reality of her predicament began to crash over her like cold water. This wasn't a shop assistant who could be bullied into submission, or a restaurant manager who would offer free meals to make an angry customer go away. This was a trained soldier whose primary job was protecting the monarchy, and she had just physically grabbed his weapon in front of hundreds of witnesses and multiple security cameras. I was just trying to get your attention, she stammered, finally releasing the sword and taking a stumbling step backward. But it was too late. Palace security had arrived, and they were approaching with the kind of coordinated movement that suggested they had dealt with similar situations before. "Madam, I need you to step away from the guard and place your hands where I can see them," commanded a security officer, whose voice carried the same unmistakable authority as the guardsman. Margaret looked around frantically, hoping to find some sympathy in the crowd, but every face she saw reflected the same mixture of shock and disapproval. "This is a misunderstanding," she protested, her voice now shaking with the first real fear she had felt all day. "I wasn't trying to hurt anyone. I just wanted him to answer some questions about the palace tour. I paid for the premium experience, and I deserve—" "Ma'am, you need to stop talking and listen carefully," the security officer interrupted. "You have just committed assault on a member of the Royal Guard and attempted to interfere with government property. You are being detained for questioning, and anything you say may be used as evidence." The words hit Margaret like physical blows. Assault? Government property? These were serious legal terms that had nothing to do with the simple customer service dispute she thought she had been having. She looked around desperately for her nephew, finally spotting him at the edge of the crowd with the expression of mortified disbelief. "David!" she called out. "Tell them I'm not a terrorist or anything. I'm just a regular person who wanted better service." But David was shaking his head slowly, his face pale with embarrassment. His wife was pulling at his arm, clearly wanting to distance themselves from the scene as quickly as possible. Other family members would later describe this as the moment they realized that Margaret's entitled behavior had finally found a situation it couldn't dominate. The security officers were professional but firm as they guided Margaret away from the guard post. The crowd parted to let them through, and she could hear whispered comments in multiple languages. Someone was definitely recording everything, and Margaret realized with growing horror that her public meltdown was probably already being uploaded to social media platforms around the world. As they walked toward the security office, Margaret caught a glimpse of Guardsman Mitchell resuming his position. His face had returned to its professional mask, but she thought she detected something that might have been satisfaction in his eyes. He had dealt with the threat exactly as his training had prepared him to do, and now he was back to the serious business of protecting the crown. The palace security office was a small, windowless room that managed to be both sterile and intimidating. Margaret found herself sitting across from a security supervisor whose patient expression suggested he had dealt with difficult tourists before, though perhaps none quite as spectacular as her. "Mrs. Henderson," he began, consulting a clipboard with what she assumed was her information. "I need you to understand the seriousness of what just occurred. This isn't a customer service issue that can be resolved with an apology and a refund. You physically grabbed a Royal Guard's weapon in front of multiple witnesses. In the current security climate, that kind of behavior has to be treated as a potential threat to national security." Margaret felt her world tilting sideways. National security? She was a middle-aged woman from Surrey who just wanted a better palace tour experience. How had wanting to speak to someone in charge turned into accusations of threatening the monarchy? "I think there's been a terrible misunderstanding," she said, her voice now completely stripped of its earlier authority. I would never hurt anyone. I just wanted some information about areas that aren't usually open to the public. I thought if I could get one of the guards to acknowledge me, he might be able to arrange something special for my American relatives." The security supervisor nodded sympathetically, but his next words made it clear that Margaret's intentions were far less important than her actions. "I'm sure you meant no harm, Mrs. Henderson, but intent isn't the only factor we consider in situations like this. You crossed a security barrier, made physical contact with a guard, and attempted to interfere with his equipment. From a security perspective, those actions have to be evaluated based on what damage they could have caused, not what damage you intended to cause." As the supervisor continued explaining the various laws and regulations she had violated, Margaret began to understand that her life was about to change in ways she had never imagined. The entitled confidence that had carried her through 5 decades of getting her own way was crumbling around her, and she was about to discover what consequences looked like when they couldn't be argued away or demanded into submission. The weight of what she had just done began to settle on her shoulders like a heavy coat, and Margaret Henderson was about to learn that there were some lines that even someone with her particular talents for creating scenes should never cross. The next few hours passed in a blur of official procedures that Margaret had only ever seen in television shows. She was formally arrested, photographed, and fingerprinted while struggling to understand how her simple complaint about poor customer service had transformed into a criminal matter. Each step of the process drove home the reality that she was no longer dealing with retail workers or restaurant managers who could be browbeaten into submission. Detective Inspector Sarah Walsh, a 20-year veteran of the Metropolitan Police, had seen plenty of tourists who got carried away during palace visits. But Margaret's case was particularly striking. As she reviewed the security footage and witness statements, she found herself watching someone whose entire worldview seemed to be collapsing in real time. "The thing that strikes me about this case," Detective Inspector Walsh later told her colleagues, "is how completely unprepared she was for the consequences of her actions. Most people who assault security personnel have some understanding that they're crossing a serious line. This woman genuinely seemed to believe that grabbing a royal guard's weapon was equivalent to getting a shop assistant's attention." Margaret sat in the interview room, still wearing the same outfit she had carefully selected for her palace tour, now wrinkled and stained with her own nervous perspiration. Her perfectly styled hair had become disheveled during the arrest process, and her makeup had smeared from the tears she had been trying not to shed. For the first time in decades, she looked exactly like what she was, a middle-aged woman who had made a terrible mistake. "I want you to understand something, Mrs. Henderson," Detective Inspector Walsh said as she began the formal interview. "What happened today isn't going to disappear because you're embarrassed about it. You didn't just have an argument with a shopkeeper. You committed assault on a member of the Royal Guard in one of the most secure locations in Britain. That has consequences that extend far beyond hurt feelings or damaged pride." Margaret nodded weakly, finally beginning to grasp the magnitude of her situation. The legal terms being used around her weren't the kind that got resolved with angry phone calls or strongly worded letters to management. Words like assault, breach of security, and potential terrorist threat carried weight that her usual tactics couldn't diminish. The detective spread out printed screenshots from various social media platforms, each showing different angles of Margaret's confrontation with Guardsman Mitchell. The images had been shared thousands of times already, accompanied by comments that ranged from disbelief to outright mockery. Margaret stared at the photos with growing horror, seeing herself through the eyes of strangers who had witnessed her public meltdown. "The internet has not been kind to your behavior today," Detective Walsh observed with professional detachment. "You're currently trending on several platforms under hashtags that I wouldn't recommend Googling. More importantly, from a legal standpoint, we have multiple video recordings of the incident from different angles, plus testimony from dozens of witnesses, including several serving police officers who were in the crowd. Margaret's phone, which had been confiscated during her arrest, had been buzzing constantly with calls from friends and family members who had seen the viral videos. Her nephew David had already given his statement to police, describing his aunt's behavior as completely out of character, while simultaneously acknowledging that she had a long history of creating scenes in public when she didn't get her way. The legal process that followed was unlike anything Margaret had ever experienced. Her usual strategy of escalating complaints until someone in authority gave her what she wanted was useless in a system designed to deal with actual criminals rather than dissatisfied customers. Every lawyer she consulted gave her the same basic advice: plead guilty, express genuine remorse, and hope for leniency from a judge who might understand that she was more foolish than dangerous. The court proceedings were a further humiliation. Margaret found herself standing before a judge who had dealt with genuine terrorists and serious criminals, trying to explain why she thought grabbing a Royal Guard's weapon was an appropriate response to poor customer service. The viral videos were played in open court, showing her behavior from multiple angles to a courtroom full of observers who clearly thought she was either dangerous or ridiculous. "Mrs. Henderson," the judge said after reviewing all the evidence, "I want to be very clear about something. The security arrangements around the royal family exist for reasons that have nothing to do with customer service or tourism revenue. When you crossed that barrier and put your hands on that guardsman's weapon, you weren't expressing dissatisfaction with a tour package. You were potentially threatening national security." The sentence, when it came, was both more and less than Margaret had feared. She avoided jail time, largely because her complete incompetence as a potential threat had convinced everyone involved that she was more embarrassing than dangerous. However, she received a substantial fine, community service hours, and most devastatingly, a permanent ban from all royal properties and events. The community service assignment was particularly fitting. Margaret found herself working at a tourist information center, helping visitors plan their London experiences and answering questions about proper behavior around royal properties. The irony was not lost on her supervisors, who made sure she understood that her job was to help tourists avoid making the same mistakes she had made. Her first day of community service was a profound lesson in humility. Margaret had to explain to confused tourists why certain behaviors were inappropriate around royal guards, knowing that many of them had probably seen the viral videos of her own spectacular failure. Each conversation was a reminder of how completely she had misunderstood the situation she had inserted herself into. The long-term consequences extended far beyond her legal punishment. Margaret's social media presence became a cautionary tale shared in training materials for tourist guides and security personnel. Her friends and family members found themselves defending or distancing themselves from her actions in conversations that continued long after the legal proceedings had ended. Perhaps most significantly, Margaret was forced to confront the reality that her lifetime strategy of demanding special treatment had finally encountered a situation where such demands were not only ineffective, but actually criminal. The Royal Guard, who had stood motionless while she grabbed his weapon, had been doing his job exactly as he was trained to do. Her assumption that she deserved different treatment because of her citizenship, her tax contributions, or her personal desires had been completely irrelevant to the situation. Months later, as Margaret completed her community service hours, she would often think about those few seconds when her hand was wrapped around Guardsman Mitchell's sword. In her memory, she could still see his eyes as he looked directly at her for the first and only time during their encounter. There had been no anger there, no personal offense taken at her behavior, just the cold professional assessment of a trained soldier dealing with a potential threat. That look had taught her something that decades of getting her own way had never shown her. There were people in the world who simply could not be bullied, demanded from, or manipulated into submission. Some lines, once crossed, led to consequences that couldn't be argued away, no matter how loudly or persistently someone complained. Margaret Henderson had finally learned what it meant to face real authority. And the lesson had cost her far more than the price of a premium palace tour.